Okay, we're looking at World War II. Today, we're kind of looking at how it all got started. And then for part two, we're going to be looking at more of the direct U.S. involvement and specifically how that influenced the home front and all of those components. So this is, like I said, for part one, which I suppose I should put here with it. It's part one. We're going to be looking at that initial start. So one of the things I want to start off with, because this term gets used a lot and it's not always understood fully. So what is fascism? Because what you have that it's with, I think, unique with World War II is the rise of fascism, specifically within two individuals that really was strong. It actually starts with Mussolini in Italy, and then Hitler's going to take it and adapt it to fit his needs as well. So I think it's kind of important that we look at what that is, because it definitely was during this period that it was a response to post-war society and all of the problems that had come with that. So, first we could say it was response to all the issues of post-war society. Starts with Mussolini, Benito Mussolini of Italy. And then, but we'll say that it goes that Hitler adapts it. All right, so we're looking at, let's say, a definition for fascism. What you're going to get, it's a political and philosophy movement of a regime that exists as a nation. And it puts race and nation above the individual and stands for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader. A dictator leader. Well, the dictator is leader, so we'll say that is it by a dictator. So, okay, so what does that mean? Which I think you need to look at. Here, I'll do one. We'll just have a C. We'll just leave it at that. Characteristics. So for characteristics, there's almost always uniforms connected to it. It's got a military style. We mentioned it's always been a response to a post-war society. And that has to do with economic, political, and spiritual breakdown. A breakdown of these foundations that were part of the nation before. Okay, and then besides that, you also have songs that become a huge part of it, rallies. It's usually the working class that it's targeted, initially at least. Specifically what it's doing with this is that it's going to end class hostilities. Because everyone becomes part of the nation. You have a cult leader. And there's usually promises of restoration of the nation. So you get support from the working class, the middle lower classes. You have all of these components that play a role, and it comes out of desperation in many cases, with just the issues of, again, a post-war society. So severe depression, which Germany is going to have. You have, and we'll look at those in just a minute with that. Some of the main doctrines that connect to, for example, let's see, we'll do 3. The main doctrines of Italian fascism were, the first was statism. And what that means is that every interest and loyalty of its members was about the state. There's the quote was nothing above the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. So that, which is a good, I think, example of what it means for, it's like extreme statism. So kind of like jingoism, but we'll see there's nationalism and jingoism involved in that as well. Nothing above the state. Nothing outside the state. And nothing against the state. The second component was nationalism. And again, extreme nationalism, which leads to jingoism, which we saw with World War I. Everything is about, again, nationhood and the people who compose it is most important. And then lastly, militarism. That nations that don't expand die. So, war is central to the success, the life of the nation. Which, you know, it's that power, hunger, and control in that sense of the people for expansion and hunger to conquer and take more, you know, under the guise of the good for the people. One of the things we mentioned was a cult leader, and I do want to look at that because that's a huge aspect of it. And of course, Mussolini and Hitler both do this. You have, it's staged addresses, specifically in rallies, where you can bring up the fervor and adoration. You have specific photographs that depict specific ideals. Mussolini, for example, was photographed bare-chested or in a uniform with a steel helmet. You have the propaganda of that, you know, you need a leader for conquest. leader is needed for conquest. Up here. You have chants, songs, and slogans, right? A lot of the things we listed go under the cult leader, but specifically for an example, they're directly tied to the leader. An example of this was Mussolini is always right. Believe, obey, fight. A minute on the battlefield is a lifetime, and the world is a lifetime of peace. So a minute on the battlefield is worth a lifetime of peace. All right, see these songs that and chants and things that put the leader as this like idealized sense. Now, communism, interestingly enough, also has a cult leader. Now, communism is not fascism, but Stalin did a lot of these cult leader tactics as well. So the cult leader isn't unique just to fascism. It is just a proponent of it, and it's a very important part of it. But you do see it in communism as well. That you have all this propaganda that the leader can solve all the problems. All the state's problems, the nation's problems. And you had, usually you have government, individuals, and then later we're all, all citizens have to swear allegiance to the government and the ruler. Okay, so that's kind of the keys of fascism, and it's really important because by having fascism is going to be what Hitler actively uses, and it's what Mussolini uses at the same time. It's why they're allies until eventually Germany takes over Italy as well. But it is this, it's kind of why so many people fell in line and supported. There's mass propaganda. I think the best example within Germany is you have not only the rallies and the propaganda, but you have the Hitler Youth as well. And we should put that one down for we'll put it as its own thing. Youth indoctrination. Right, so the example with this would be the Hitler Youth. It is essentially you're brainwashing the young, the youth, to blindly follow and support the fascist ideals and the leader. Because if you start with the young, oops, I went to numbers. Sorry there. If you start with the young, and as they grow up, they become significantly more, not only indoctrinated, but loyal in the process. And it's very much what the Hitler Youth and what they were trying to do there. So, how did Hitler come to power? What you have try that again. There we go. So what you have at the end of World War One, the Kaiser, who was in charge before, he abdicates, and then Kaiser switches to the Weimar Republic. And the Kaiser was essentially king, right? So at the end of World War One, the Kaiser abdicates, and instead it transitions to a Weimar Republic, who then leads the surrender of Germany in World War One. And with this, the party, the German Republic, it was, you had the Constitution, you had the government, right, and voting. It was the Democratic Republic. Sorry. And so this isn't the new shift. The problem was, of course, that there are several things for why it's, let's say, a weakened state that makes it open for Hitler to take over. So what were the problems? Well, the first was the Versailles Treaty. The Versailles Treaty had some really rough stipulations that are going to cause problems. And we talked about this before at the end of World War One, but I'm not going to list all of them, just the top 4 that really played a role in allowing Hitler to take over by playing on Germans' sentiment and concerns and issues. The reparations was one, right? And this will lead to several things. They were expected to pay for the whole cost of war, which was just, I mean, it was ridiculous. And so how does this work? Well, the US lends money to Germany, right? Germany pays European state nations, and the European nations repay the US for their loans, right? So it goes back to us, and it continues this cycle. Of course, where this is going to be problematic is the Great Depression equals problems, because once, you know, this stops, and it creates massive inflation and everything else. Well, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute. The second one of the Versailles Treaty was the War Guilt Clause. And the War Guilt Clause was that Germany had to take responsibility and I guess and blame for the whole war. And this is what you could say was psychologically damaging. And for many, seen as kind of depressing. And so because of what it did is it took away national pride. And remember that, and this is kind of a big thing. It took away national pride. nationalism was a big thing, and in of itself, it's not a bad thing. And if you take that away and tell someone that they cannot, you have to feel guilty for everything you did. And it wasn't just, and World War One wasn't just Germany's fault. Like, they got the brunt of the blame, but they weren't the only ones. They weren't even the ones that initially started the war. But they got the brunt of it, and this is going to, when you combined everything with the reparations, with the guilt clause and the depression that leads to the actual economic depression, along with this kind of depression of losing national pride, many people felt hopeless. And I think that's this feeling of hopelessness is going to lead to an opening for Hitler to jump in and promise all sorts of things. Demilitarization. Germany had to completely disband the majority of its army, of military. So there was a feeling that they could not protect themselves. Again, also kind of going back to feeling hopelessness. And then the last one was occupation of the Rhineland. And what this was essentially said that Germany had to basically remove themselves from the Rhineland, which was seen as a buffer zone between Germany and France. And you could have European occupation in that area. And what this was another reminder of their loss and lack of control. So you have those are the big ones from the Versailles Treaty that played a huge role in this sense of, like I said, you have a weak economic state. We'll put it, so the list of things is you have the Versailles Treaty, and from all these things, it creates again a sense of problem with this weak economic state, this sense of dishonor and not being able to feel pride. You had to see that as cede part of their territory, and the army was down to just 100,000 men, and Hitler's going to use all of this as propaganda, and specifically a scapegoat in the process. So from these main components, we'll put it here, Hitler uses these as propaganda, and then couples it with a scapegoat for their problems. Which, of course, was the Jews. And so we'll get back to that. We'll definitely talk more about that. One of the things that happens that becomes a significant part of it is hyperinflation from the Depression. What you get is it's just a huge problem in the sense that you had like 33 billion debt created by all of this. And this is back in the 1920s, so it's a lot debt, and this is going to create anger from the German public in the process. To anger for the debt, anger, and feeling like all of it's being placed on them. Initially, as I mentioned, it seemed like they were doing okay. They borrowed, because they were never going to be able to pay this back, from the US, and it created the payment cycle that I showed you before. But of course, when the US goes in debt, when the US has the Great Depression, we stop giving them money. Right? We stop giving money, and that of course puts them into a depression. Okay, and that's going to create huge problems because you end up with massive issues. So we'll say the facts. One, by 1929, you had over 2 million unemployed. And in 1932, it was 6 million. So it's a huge jump. And in those 3 years, from 1929 to 1932, in 3 years, you had production of goods and stuff dropped 44%. Which, of course, what does that lead to? That leads to more job loss, as well as economic power within the nation. So, more job loss and economic power and control in the nation. And then it had problems with farmers and food production. Which is going to lead to having an issue with having enough food. So like serious issues with hunger, food. They did try, so one of the ways that they tried to fix it, which was not helpful, they did try to fix it, the government did, by printing more money, which is always a bad way. If you have to print a lot of money, what's it equals bad? It does not work out because this creates inflation. So if you printed a little bit of money, it wouldn't. But when you print a lot of money, and the problem was the Weimar Republic printed way too much money to try to throw it back into the economy. It creates massive inflation. So to give you an idea, a pound of potatoes in 1932 cost 9 marks. Okay, by October, this was in January. So here, 1932 in January cost 9 marks. In October of 1932, it was 40 million marks. That's how this is hyperinflation. Beef went for 2 trillion marks per pound. Okay, I mean this is not sustainable. This doesn't work. Essentially, the mark became worthless. There's pictures of where they basically had stacks of money, and kids were just playing with these stacks of marks. They had them in bricks, and they were just stacking them up like they were toy bricks, because it was that worthless. You couldn't buy, like, again, if it's 2 trillion, 40 million, I mean, it was just absurd. The mark bought almost nothing. Very few people had enough money to purchase anything. And of course, anyone on fixed income, middle families and poor families were just utterly destroyed in the process. So a variety of things, were with that. It's this economic thing, and then hyperinflation made it even worse. And then those 4 components with the Versailles Treaty, like I said, were essential to this problem. The mark was worth more as a toy for children or fuel for fire. This actually was something similar, not to this extreme, but happened with the Confederacy during the Civil War, because the Confederate dollar became worthless too, and people, like I said, would have wheelbarrows full of it to buy like a loaf of bread. And in Germany, like I said, it was even worse than that. And so, like I said, you had like these stacks of it. There's pictures of kids just playing with these massive stacks of money because they couldn't buy anything with it. Or like I said, it was more valuable as paper to burn to keep warm than it was for purchasing or being able to do anything. So these things are all of these things are what sets the stage for Hitler to come in and be a persuasive individual for getting involved in the government. So let's put Hitler here. Who he was born in Austria. And we know that he actually initially wanted to become an artist. But was rejected from art school. Which, there's something to say about leaders. He wanted to be an artist. Here, just to see these leaders. Hitler, an artist. Mussolini was an elementary school teacher. And Stalin, a poet. These are other things that they did or wanted to do. What does it say about failing in these occupations or not having them succeed that then goes so crazy to this kind of opposite direction, if you will, in the process. And so he was in the military in World War I. So fought for the German army in World War I. And after the war, he joined the National Socialist Workers' Party. Right, which is what became the Nazis. For short in German, is how it worked. And the Nazis were one of several militant groups that were dissatisfied with the Germany situation. So you already had some of that military component. They wore uniforms. And already had military component. Now, they don't fit all of the fascist stuff at all. Hitler's going to transform that. But that was one aspect of it. And so Hitler ended up moving. Eventually, Hitler became leader of the group. One of the things that it said about Hitler was that he was charismatic. And charming. And the other thing that he does is his speeches were simple and clear for the lower classes, which made him popular with them. Because it was said in many things like that. It was that he was speaking to them. He is the one that, as leader of the group, shifted the movement to scapegoats against, obviously, the Jewish population, the Jews, Marxism, which is communism, and capitalism. So he blamed he and then his group blamed all of them for the Germany's woes. Right? They were the cause of Germany's problems. And then he portrayed himself as a hero and savior to the German people, right? Which is part of that cult leader worship and hero. So what happens with this is the Nazi Party, they don't start off, and he's leader of the group, but not president or leader of the German government at this point. What the goal was, the Nazi Party worked to have representation in the Weimar Republic. And they specifically were pretty much against against everything the Weimar Republic did. So why does this work? Because, right, the Weimar Republic kind of gets blamed for Germany's issues that we listed before, because of the Versailles Treaty and those main issues, because of inflation. Many people saw the Weimar Republic, Weimar government as failing, right? Because of what we said, we already looked at the previous issues, which were, like I said, the Versailles Treaty and inflation, and all the points of the Versailles Treaty in the process. So so the Weimar Republic kind of gets blamed for this, and then the Nazi Party is the one that's been saying, look, we said we're against everything they've been doing in the process, and and this is, we can fix it, we can make it better. And so they didn't start off having like huge support, but they kept hammering and promoting propaganda that they could save Germany. And in the process, they gave the Germans someone to blame. Right? You feel crappy, things suck, you're hungry. We can make it better again. We can improve it. And so they do start getting support from those most impacted, small farmers, and property holders in general, but that weren't wealthy. That this specifically also led to, like I said, the lower classes, and the lower, we'll say lower middle classes. And not everyone, but you did have what the key with is those most impacted by Germany's situation who felt the Weimar government was not helping them, was failing and not helping them. And this was easier to get more people as the situation continued to have problems. As Germany continued to have problems and things got worse and worse, people started looking, because a lot of people said, well, you got to give them time, And as time went on and things got worse, like, okay, this isn't working. What do we need to do to fix this? And the Nazi Party was so great at promoting that they could do that. And here's who you really should blame. It's not your fault. As a German, no, it's this, and this, right? And we can fix this. We can restore, German pride, which is going to be a big part that especially Hitler's going to play on, is that he can restore German pride. And in fact, not only restore it, that it never should have gone away. Right? He promises the economic too and all that other stuff, but this was a big one. We need to stop feeling guilty for the war. We've paid enough. This needs to be over, and we're going to make it better for you. So what ends up happening is in 1930, you have the Nazi Party won 107 of the 577 seats in the Reichstag, which was the foundation of the German government, right? You had a chancellor, you had the president, and then you had the Reichstag, which was the party, the members that voted, kind of like Congress for us, and they were basically second only to the Social Democrats, which was the main ruling party at the time. So this was 1930 was a big win for that. Hitler ran for president, but was not elected. Instead, he was appointed chancellor, which here's the big mistake. By the president that was elected. And so why? Right? Why do this? Because the president hoped to create a conservative coalition government, essentially, by bringing the Nazi into line with a less radical group. Essentially, what does this mean? Essentially, he thought he could control, he could control the Nazi group, the Nazi party. And make them fall in line. Of course, the problem with this is that he underestimated Hitler and his ambitions. I can spell Hitler here. There we go. Hitler and his ambitions. Did I do that elsewhere too? Let's see. Apparently, became dyslexic in the process of writing Hitler. Hitler. Do that everywhere. I can hear it. All right. We'll have it right eventually. Sorry about that. Yeah, that's just like switch those ones around for some reason. Okay, so underestimated Hitler and his ambitions, and ultimately, what he could do with it. So Hitler's in charge to a degree now, and certainly has a lot of power. Let's go back to E, F, or G now. So with Hitler in power, he used this to his advantage. And what happened was, an event that happened is that there's lots of conspiracy theories behind this event. But suppose there was a Dutch anarchist group that was connected to supposedly the Communist Party, and they set fire to the Reichstag. He used this event, to suspend civil liberties. As seen as, which you claimed as a defensive measure. And it fit perfectly with the Nazi line that the communism was, evil. And this act of violence. And what he convinced the president to dissolve the Reichstag. And order a new election, saying that it had been corrupted, that they needed to, clean it out and clear it out. And then what happened under Hitler's persuasion is Parliament legally granted him unlimited power for the next 4 years. Legally granted him unlimited power for the next 4 years, and had basically had the president ends up going away. Hitler becomes in charge, and so then Hitler proclaimed this a new Reich, which was, he called it the Third Reich. And moved to crush all opposition. Because his power at this point wasn't fully complete, or become part of Nazi party. But it's super strong now, because there still is some opposition. Okay, he's not totally incomplete, but with this new power, he can use it to completely become a one-state party with Hitler as the dictator in the process. So this is how he takes over. Oops, let's see. Well, so we'll do Nazi Germany now. I think we're on 3. My whole system of this time is off. Problem when recording late. Not only do I fail to spell Hitler correctly, but I don't know my order this time around. Okay, so what happens as you have this transition to to Nazi Germany? One of the big things that it's characteristic of is the use of violence to create a single party state with Hitler as dictator and supreme leader, essentially. And they use this as propaganda for several things. And we talked about some of these already, but national pride, Hitler as a savior, which created the Führer cult in the process, which is that cult leader component. He was charismatic, and he did bring, people, he did get loyalty and support from them. He promised economic revival. And then, of course, created scapegoats to blame, which then, of course, is going to be used for eventually, the this is what then leads to the Holocaust. But it was also, again, communism and capitalism in the process too. But especially communism. He promised to bring it back, Germany back to national greatness and overthrow, right, that's part of the national pride, but promised to bring back Germany to greatness and overthrow the Versailles Treaty. And for many people, this was appealing. It kind of targeted all of those aspects. So one of the things in order to crush the opposition party is Hitler created the stormtroopers. The stormtroopers were there, again, to get rid of opposition and maintain order and discipline and help Hitler remain in charge. They, so the social order and everything else, and so this helped him maintain the power that he needed, and also to enforce it, essentially. Now, the problem is that some of the more conservative groups that had helped actually make Hitler chancellor were concerned, and he actually did have, there was some dissent in the SA, which is the stormtroopers. And so what ends up happening is in June 30th of 1934, you had what was called the Night of long knives. And this is that many high-ranking SA and others were killed in essentially a purge style effort to solidify his control. And this led to creation of the SS under Heinrich Himmler. The SS were the ones that are going to be the which they became known as the Gestapo. And they're the ones that are going to play a very key role in the ghettos and concentration camps. Essentially, it said that they were the military police force to essentially create the Holocaust. Right? It was because of the SS that they were the ones that rounded up the Jews, that put them into the ghettos, that then moved into the concentration and created a whole extermination plan. Under Himmler was the main creator of that. So let's put here at the called, I don't know, the start of the Holocaust. Right, because you're gonna have where the Hitler taking over, but and then starting to expand and conquer other European places. But before as he start, actually this is all starting as then they start to move in and take other parts as well. So at first was about consolidating power and control, and then ultimately enacting and beginning to enact the plan of the Holocaust. So with that, you have that Himmler saw his mission, his and the SS, to fight political and racial enemies of the state. The first concentration camp was Dachau, which was opened in March of 1933. The secret state police, right? The Gestapo, they were the ones that were responsible for this. But what's interesting is that the Gestapo was often, not mostly, often understaffed for the whole process. Because, right, remember, their whole process was for arrest, incarceration, of people in camps, in the ghetto first, in some areas, and camps. And then, of course, the murder of millions of people. But because this takes a lot of people, and especially finding people, they often relied on hints and tips by ordinary citizens. Right? Because this, well, one, there was indoctrination. Some of it was personal too, because it wasn't, the secret police, their goal was twofold, right? Political and racial enemies. So they were at both times targeting non-Jewish German citizens as well as the Jewish population to eliminate, because right, the goal was to eliminate all opposition as well as the Jewish population. And so that's key with it, is that that you weren't, they're obviously going to shift largely to just targeting the Jewish population, but they started out doing both. Of course, then racism with what was called the Jewish question was Hitler's really main obsession, which he had made initially less central in his campaigns until he came into control. And once Hitler came to power, right, then he shifted his focus to first excluding and then removing. So you had racial laws started as early as 1933 to limit civil liberties and rights for Jewish people. Started, like I said, as early as 1933. And this, you had boycotts of Jewish goods and stores, which part of this process was excluding Jewish people from public office. And from here, it went to other things like such as jobs and areas in the city. So I guess I'll just put this as a separate thing because it's actually several things. So public office, boycotts, and labeling. This is a huge part too. Labeling as Jewish, right? It's going to eventually be the star, not yet, but that identifying, that's a huge part of it. So part of the other would be not only public office and boycotts, but then it was that they were excluded from certain jobs, schooling, certain schooling, and intermixing with pure German citizens, as it was seen. Public places were limited, things like that. So it was kind of this. It wasn't all at once. It was this slow process of slowly taking away things, taking away, being able to label and find, taking away from public office, and then jobs and schooling, and things like that. Then you had in 1935. You had the Nuremberg decrees, and this was even more specific with it deprived Jews based on bloodline, right? So it wasn't just which is important, not just religion, but as a whole race, right? Not their German citizenship. So you start off with these things, and now they were no longer considered German citizens. Prohibited marriage between Germans and Jews, right? Because they were now no longer seen as Germans. This also, and this limited other rights in the process. And then this culminated in violence that escalated to what became known as Kristallnacht, which was what it means is Night of Broken Glass. And what it was, you had in November, this whole campaign, this is in 1938, you had over 7,500 Jewish stores destroyed. And they burned nearly 2,000 synagogues. And killed 91 Jews at this particular time, and beat up a lot more. So you you had massive violence that made it clear, and Kristallnacht made it clear that there was no safe place for really being Jewish anymore. There was only 1 year before the whole outbreak of war, which then really made it impossible for Jewish people to escape. Many people, saw this because the thing with this was as well. Okay, so this is happening, but it's not. The one of the questions, well, why did so many Jews willingly go to the ghettos before they go into concentration camps? And because it was believed, if not in this day, in this modern age, is there going to be genocide? Is there going to be an extermination of people? Yes, this is horrible and the situation sucks, but this will pass. And some, that's where some direction went. Some people did leave after this, after Kristallnacht, after losing German citizenship, but it really became harder and harder from 1935 on to be able to leave. And of course, not much long after that, there's going to be the active extermination through the shift to ghettos and everything else. So this was basically this whole system was about mobilizing actually it is part of Nazi Germany, we'll see, not and basically consolidating power. Right, that's what this was about. This was about establishing what Nazi Germany was and mobilizing the power in the process. And we'll talk more about the Holocaust from this point on a little bit later. Okay, so the other part then is of breakdown of peace and to war. Because once he had consolidated we'll say internal power and control, then he moved to looking at, we'll say, foreign policy, which were based on some of the promises that he had made. So one of them was basically ending the Versailles Treaty. And in 1935, Hitler declared that they were no longer bound by the Versailles Treaty. And prior to this, he had, we'll put this here. Before the formal announcement, he had been violating the Versailles Treaty. And specifically, one of those areas was more military. But what happened is that you had British and French, we'll say, looked the other way. The fear was fear of war, and remembering World War I, they didn't want that to happen again. And as much as there was this sentiment with, like I said, with the Jewish population of, okay, this is only going to go so far, this, there's non-extermination in this day and age, the idea of appeasement of Hitler was seen as, okay, we'll just do this little bit. He's only going to go so far, and this will temper things, and this way we don't get into war, because we don't want a war. Not realizing that Hitler wanted a war, and there was no level of appeasement that was going to end that. But this was a misunderstanding of Hitler and his goals. Right? No form of appeasement was going to work. But this is the reason they didn't immediately jump in, because there was hope that, at some point he would stop in the process. So Hitler had created a large military, and he said that they would re-strengthen. They'd one of the big things with this was that they were going to restore conscription, which meant the draft, right? That the German men would be required to be part of the military, and also build Air Force and Navy. And many people were excited about this, Germans, because it felt like, yeah, we're finally restoring Germany's greatness in that process. And then on March 7th, 1936, Hitler marches into the Rhineland. Right, this area violated the Versailles Treaty, of course, which he pretty much said was done anyway. What Hitler claimed with this, and how they justified not taking it and not going to war over this, is Hitler said, we're not expanding, right? We're just sending soldiers to the frontier. And then later he calls it living space, right? This is part of Germany, and we need the living space. And the idea was, we're not conquering, right? This is how Hitler portrayed it. We're not conquering. This is just living space. This was our territory. This German citizens live here, right? We just need our space back again, and we're just moving them to the frontier, and that was what the French and British didn't like it, but they weren't willing to go to war over it, and convince themselves still that he wasn't going to go too far. The next thing that he wanted to do was to incorporate Austria into Germany and part of the government in Third Reich. Now, this was also prohibited by Versailles Treaty, which, of course, at this point, everything he did was, I didn't stop him. It prohibited any kind of joint union, but he did so anyways, and he, he pressured the Austrian Chancellor to accept Austrian Nazis into his cabinet. Into Austria's cabinet government. Right? So that essentially, what's the goal of this? It's again to take control when he is ready, right? I mean, it's all that sneaky grew up, and then ultimately when they resisted, when there was resistance, then Hitler drew up plans for invasion and demanded that a new government was formed by the Austrian Nazis. Hitler planned invasion and threatened that I will take you over, and instead the requirement is a new government controlled by Austrian Nazis. And so this is how he took Austria, by just kind of how he'd taken power in Germany, slyly moving in. And ultimately, the British and French didn't feel Austria was worth a war. And again, looking back, hindsight is 2020, and you go, oh my gosh, like how many signs did he have to give? But for them, it was looking at this extreme fear of another war, which is World War II, happen, and didn't they weren't willing to step in yet. So he used the pretext of preventing violence, right? That was his goal. Hitler ordered troops into Austria to prevent the violence on March 13th, 1938. And then the leaders that he'd put in place, right? The Austrian Nazi leaders declared Austria a province of the German Reich. All right, and then this actually, it was celebrated as this amazing event. Next, he took Czechoslovakia. And for time, let's see. Here we'll just let's actually do this. Further conquest and what was called the Blitzkrieg, lightning war, essentially, is what's going to, this is going to be known as the Blitzkrieg, lightning war. So he takes Czechoslovakia, and then Poland. And then you're going to have actually Mussolini and Hitler going to enter into the Pact of Steel. So this isn't a conquest yet, but it is important for that. So Hitler and Mussolini enter Pact of Steel to become allies in 1939, which is going to play a huge role with just, of course, his clear plans in the process for conquering areas. And like I said, they attacked Poland so fast that it like I said, is considered this lightning war, because Poland surrendered in less than a month after taking Poland. And let's see, I put up a map here so we could see. Ultimately, the areas is going to go into Russia later, and they're going to take Italy. But you have Germany, and you have Czechoslovakia, Austria, Czechoslovakia. It's going to be Hungary and Romania and Poland, and France. So the big this huge thing of that from Hitler went from almost nothing to not only taking France, but then going for the British in the process. You also are going to have the Nazi-Soviet pact, which shocked the world, of a non-aggression pact in order to not have a two-front war. Because the idea with this is that ultimately, if Russia, because you have here Great Britain here coming in, and if they're attacking, and France at the time, right? If Russia started attacking, and this will be the problem, it becomes a huge problem. But once you have the pact of non-aggression, he doesn't have to worry about being attacked from this side and can focus all of the forces towards the rest of Europe. Where Hitler's problems are actually going to come is when they start going to Russia. They're now having a two-front war, which, he was trying to avoid. So then you have the Nazi-Soviet pact, which was a non-aggression pact. Like, as I mentioned, it shocked the world, and it forever created massive relationship issues with Soviet Union, aka Russia later, and the Western world. Think specifically, right, the Cold War, and we still have issues with them today. And then you have France, right? After taking Poland, France did not take long either. And this puts it into a full-fledged war in the process with the fall of Poland, with the fall of France. And then in 1940, by 1940, you had Germany go for Denmark, and then Norway. And then he actually Denmark surrendered within hours. The British tried to, and French tried to assist Norwegians, but it was, again, a little too late. And there was a few of the British Isles that they did conquer. Not mainland Britain. Right, so that's important with it, is that there's a small little group of isles that he did conquer. He did want to go to Britain, but he didn't. He wasn't successful. But they did conquer a few isles. So this is this lightning, this blitzkrieg, the lightning war, and this puts it into a full-fledged war with Europe. All right, and then what's going to happen is, of course, the U.S. Well, we're going to next for part 2. We're going to look at the U.S. reactions to this, and then, of course, Japan's involvement with war, where they had their own war going on that kind of used Hitler and Germany's war to wage their own against China, and then ultimately deciding to attack us with Pearl Harbor and how that gets into war. So part 2 will be looking at U.S. reaction, how we get involved, the two Western and Eastern front, along with, of course, the home front and other things that way. And then, of course, the end of war. We'll be talking about like the Holocaust and other atrocities, atomic weapons, and kind of looking at actually a lot of the atrocities that took place on every side of this war, because it really was devastating to so many different groups of people. And also just and on pretty much every group, civil liberties and rights were restricted to varying degrees in a variety of ways. So we're going to look at that as well. Okay, so that's for this part, and we'll finish up with part 2.